Thank you very much for that long introduction. It sort of reminded me of the old days. It is always a pleasure to be on campus, be with the faculty and the students and share some of the life and professional experiences here. And I know that there will be an opportunity this afternoon to meet with some of you later and maybe discuss some of the details of the material that I will be presenting here. How many of you are from Africa? Then you should be giving this talk, not I. Very good, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to exchange some thoughts and ideas on that. And how many of you have been to Africa? Quite a few, or that's good. So the reason I'm going to share the experience in Africa is to sort of provide a big picture of the kinds of issues that the technical and non-technical professionals have to face in any kind of a forward progress and development. And Africa provides a very good example, and you will see in the process how there are such great opportunities in places where one might think that it's rather hopeless. So that's one of the reasons. And the other thing is that I do not intend to present a highly technical electrical engineering or civil engineering talk here. It is basically hoped that you will sort of be intrigued with some of the issues that a professional has to face, which goes beyond just technical and calculations, in order to be able to advance the process. And we're going to discuss that a little bit here together. And at the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and perhaps later this afternoon when we meet together, I'll be able to share some personal experiences and some do's and don'ts in terms of professional activities that may be of some benefit and use to you. So with that, I'll move forward. A bit of an overview of Africa, and again, those of you who are from there know all this. It's quite a large part of the world, and by size, comparative size, and of course, the comparison is always a dangerous thing to do, but it's about 4 times the size of the United States, so it's quite a large area of the world. Very large population. By 2025, will be 1.2 billion people. The poorest and probably least developed by most standards. As a whole, there are 54 countries. And often when people talk about Africa, they have absolutely no idea, and including in this country, that they think it's just one country. Or they say, well, you know, there's something out there. And they remember maybe that some of us, some who are like close to my age, may think that it's John Wayne chasing animals on the plains of Africa. Well, that's not the case at all. And I hope that we'll change that perception, if any exists, soon. Now, what is most interesting is that the average population is among the youngest in the world and will continue to be so. So you can automatically and immediately assume that there's going to be an amazing workforce in the world of that size. And imagine what can be done with that workforce. So please have that kind of a vision as we go through this presentation together. Now, there's a legacy of colonialism and the oppression caused by Europeans and others. And there's a whole story of that, obviously. There's a tribal approach primarily to governance, which is really a challenge, and many of you who are from there know what that means. Corruption, human rights issues, and so forth run rampant, and the most recent one, of course, was Zimbabwe and other parts of Africa. And central planning has been, in general, somewhat of a failure, less success in that area. And then, of course, there's lack of access to hard currency, and that's where the real investment comes in. And 80% of the population lives on less than $2.50 a day. And basic line for poverty is about $1.50 a day. So most of the population in Africa is right in that neighborhood. Do you have any idea what the per capita daily income is in the United States? Any thoughts? It's in the $80 range. So there's vast natural resources, and this is where the major move forward from Africa is going to come. And I'm going to talk about the concept of leapfrogging. And this is what we need to remember. So there are lots of unique opportunities in development in Africa, which is worth looking at very carefully. Now, one thing that we want to look at is the world at night, to start with. And of course, I think most of us will recognize this, huh?
Yeah.
All right, we know where that is. This is Europe, Japan, huh? Out here. A little bit down here, and Latin America. Africa isn't showing, unfortunately. Is it?
Yeah, it's South Africa, a little bit above it.
What is this?
Yeah, right there.
Johannesburg?
Yeah.
Cape Town? Cairo? Basically, a little bit West Africa, Abuja and other places. And the rest of Africa is dark. There is the challenge, and there is the opportunity. And there's a direct relationship between human development index, which is a series of parameters that go together to show that I won't get into that now. And this is basically access to electricity. Most of Africa falls right here. And the rest of the world sort of follows along here. The United States is about there for comparison purposes. So there's a direct relationship between availability of energy and development. And we're going to explore that a little bit more. So access, about half the population of Africa does not have access to electricity. You can see how light these colors are compared to the rest of the world. And in terms of equivalent of kilograms of oil used, in this country we use about 13,000 per capita, whereas in Africa, the best that one can do is about 600, 680. So there's quite a bit of discrepancy in there in terms of comparison. Again, the comparison is always dangerous, as I had mentioned before, but this is just to give us an idea of haves versus have-nots. And energy inequity, of course, contributes a great deal to all kinds of regional issues and problems. You see that Africa sits here in terms of energy consumption. The world average is about here. So it's quite a difficult challenge currently in terms of energy in Africa. And availability is quite low. You see most African countries fall below what is considered generally the minimum for progress and development. But these challenges also mean opportunities, and that's really, as engineers and as people who are professionals, we would look at these challenges and see how challenges can be turned into opportunities. So let's explore that a little bit more, dig a little deeper. Another issue is the power is expensive. See, this is roughly the range of power that you would expect in most developing countries. You can see that most African countries are well above that, with some exceptions. And this is in terms of cost of power. What is the cost of a kilowatt hour of power here in the United States, approximately? Okay.
12 cents.
12 cents. It's about 12 cents. And you can see that sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of the tariff, is about there. So the cost is about what we pay here, but the availability is not there. That's where the connection between these two issues come. You see, this is consumption versus cost. South Asia, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America, OECD is much higher than that. And I'm sure you know what OECD is, huh? Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a group of 35, 36 countries, including the United States and Canada, that work on various development issues together. And often you come across OECD. The United States has not pulled out of it yet, and it's quite possible that the administration doesn't know that we're even a member. Back to Africa. Coal is the largest source of energy in Africa. You can see it's quite high. If there's a large expansion scenario, coal will be reduced substantially and hydro will increase quite a bit in Africa. But if it's a sort of a slow development, there will be a bit of more of a balance among them. But the idea is that if we move on a rather aggressive trajectory, then the trade expansion will bring out hydro, which is more of a renewable resource, and reduce coal and some of the other sources. So Africa is poorest and most vulnerable to risk. Heavy reliance on burning wood and charcoal, and you often find this kind of a thing along the road in Africa where this is what people use and burn for fuel. Very little electrification at the rural level, maybe a little bit of solar, and it is possible to move away from carbon-based electricity towards much cleaner system. And this is where the leapfrogging will come, and I'll share a little bit more of that later. The sources of greenhouse gases, again, the share of Africa is very small compared to the rest of the world. And a lot of that comes from land use change, which is basically burning. This picture was taken last July. And there's a lot of burning and clearing that goes on, and that is the main source of the impact. But in terms of general contribution, it's extremely small, which means if you're starting from small contribution and you're going to have the opportunities to generate power in a renewable fashion, then there's an opportunity for leapfrogging well past everybody else. And I'm going to show you a graph of that in just a moment. Hydro has the largest potential in terms of renewable resource in Africa. And there's this large one is in Congo, and I'm going to come back and share a case study on that a little bit later. But then hydrologic variability and climate change has a tremendous impact on Africa, particularly on the water resources of Africa. The natural legacy in Africa is extreme variability, and this is a kind of a dated figure, but it's about the same in terms of plus or minus almost 40% variability around the mean. Imagine if you're producing electricity and your electricity varies plus or minus 40% around the mean, what will happen? So it's quite difficult to manage. But then there's a historical legacy. There's 60 international rivers in Africa, many of them with hydropower capability, but these are international rivers, which means countries have to cooperate in order to gain benefit. Now, the legacy and the issue there is that a lot of times the argument is, I want to share the water. I want my drop of water. The thinking is slowly changing. Instead of sharing the drops of water, we generate benefit from water via electricity and other things, and share electricity. Much easier to share electrons than it is to share drops of water, as you can imagine. These are the opportunities in Africa that I think will help with the major leapfrogging forward in the near future. The impact of climate change, a little bit to share on that. Africa has warmed 0.5 degrees over the last century. And what is the Paris Accord? To hold the planet to 1.5 to 2 degrees maximum. So we're already quite a ways up there. in Africa. And that's the difficulty. Now, what it takes to hold us to that kind of 1.5 to 2 is something that we can discuss maybe afterwards if we have an opportunity. In terms of rainfall, the sub-Sahel or northern part of Africa will have a lot less. Southern half will have a lot more. That doesn't mean that there's more opportunities, more flooding and more problems. Particularly Kenya really suffers from this kind of a change. The exposure risk is really high. You'll see that most countries are in their high or moderate risk in terms of floods, droughts, sea level rise as well. And these risks are high. So production of energy and power at this kind of risk is something of a challenge that has to be addressed and dealt with. And it isn't just the construction and the engineering part of it. It's also the insurance part of it. If you're developing a particular level of electricity here at TVA, for example, they have a contract to deliver so much to a particular user, a particular client. If they can't deliver it, there's a penalty associated with it. And this kind of penalty through climate change is something that insurance will have to address, which makes it that more important for those of you who may be doing some work in uncertainty and climate change issues related to power generation is how do you quantify uncertainties and risks associated with these kinds of forces that we cannot control, and we experienced here in the United States this past season, a lot of that. How do you quantify that? And how do you build that into the development so that the investor knows what the risks are? So these are the big kind of issue challenges related to policy. In terms of water availability and basin yield, I won't get into all the details of this. This is based on some of the work that I did at the World Bank a few years ago. By 2030, to 2050, you can see that, I don't know how well you can see that, a lot more red in there in terms of yield, that means water availability. And if the water availability is reduced, then hydropower suffers. And also investment suffers. You can see that you go from 2030 to 2050, a period of 20 years, a lot more risk associated with investments that go into Africa. Some of that is power related. So what will be a path forward? Improve and scale up of a regional generation and transmission system. In other words, each country for itself may not be able to handle the risk, the investment need, and the issues, and may be able to produce power, but may not have the market for it. But a cluster and a regional approach will allow to mitigate some of those risks and attract investors. Now, there's a downside to all of this, and I'm sure that you can figure all that out, but we'll come back and address that in a moment. Transformative regional projects that go beyond just energy production. That will include, of course, hydro, natural gas, wind, geothermal. All of that is available in Africa. And improve and modernize the function of the utilities. So a number of those may hit some interesting spots in your thinking in terms of your own work and profession here and the contribution that you might make. Strengthen regional power sector planning. Regional planning versus in-country planning. We talked about the fact that the central planning is quite weak in many African countries. But if you go to regional planning, then you bring in the interest, multiple interests for multiple purposes. Hydro project with a focus on integrated water resource management, because the hydro projects have more than just generation of electricity, and I'll mention that again a little bit later. And invest in a low carbon development trajectory. And that is the opportunity for Africa. As an aside, at least most of the projects that I was involved with in Africa at the World Bank, just about every transmission line that we financed, there was a requirement that the hookups be there for future installation of fiber optics, right on top of these lines. It's so, relatively speaking, so much cheaper to have this available. And when the time comes, it's already in place. And this is the kind of leapfrogging that Africa can do in this. And it doesn't cost very much to have that available on top of these transmission lines for long distance travel. And of course, regional trade can save a lot of money in terms of carbon and other factors. So basically then, Africa could be moving from fossil towards wind, hydro, and solar. And those opportunities exist. I won't get into details of all this. I just mentioned hydro a little bit later via a couple of examples. So today, Africa is here. Low production, low emission. The rest of us are here. Europe, United States, China, and others. High production, high emission. And everybody has to be here in order for the planet to survive. Africa can go directly across. It does not have to go up and come back down again. And that is the advantage of Africa in the long run. And of course, we don't have the time to get into all the details of that, but there are many ways of doing this, to just transition directly across into a low carbon development. That not only will it help Africa itself in terms of natural resources, but it will allow negotiations with those who are producing a lot and need to be able to operate through some kind of a banking system to reduce their own impact. I want to share with you a couple of examples of regional power transmission. At some point, Barbara, who was also a former World Bank staff, spent, I guess, about 15 years of her life working with the countries that are around the Nile on power and a number of other things, and I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for her to perhaps talk with you at some point. But here, I'll just give you a couple of examples around the Nile, where you can see the various transmission systems and interconnections are under planning or already under implementation. And it has saved a great deal of money, and then also produced enough energy to really electrify large portions of these regions, of these countries. The program itself has all sorts of other activities. It's called the Nile Basin Initiative Program. I won't get into the details of that here, except to share with you that there are several power projects that and investments that will help a great deal along the lines of regional development. And under preparation are a few of those. And generally, these are referred to as backbone systems, because they're the long lines, the lines that go across, and then of course you branch off from those. And quite a bit of that is going on in Eastern Africa. Ethiopia and Sudan, for example, have power connection now. Ethiopia can generate a great deal of energy because it's sitting up high in the mountains, and they can produce high. And there's a large dam that there's under construction now called the Renaissance Dam, and there's a lot of controversy associated with that. I guess we have some time. Let me just divert for one moment. I remember about 20 years ago now. Yeah, 20 years ago, I was working in Egypt, and President Mubarak was in charge there. And I remember distinctly reading in the English version of the newspaper one morning that the word had come out that the Ethiopians were planning on building a dam on the Nile. And Mubarak's response on the front page of the newspaper was, "Let them build the dam. We will send our Air Force on Inauguration Day." That was the attitude and the relationship between nobody touches the Nile, because these are the pharaohs, the Egyptians are the pharaohs of the Nile, and nobody touches the Nile. It was that kind of attitude. Today, things are beginning to change. Egypt is not able to produce the power it needs. So let the Ethiopians produce it and buy it from them at a good price. And you don't have to bring all that water to Aswan Dam, some of you know what Aswan Dam is, and let it evaporate almost at twice as the rate that the power that we produce farther up. So this is where these kinds of cooperations can come. And imagine getting into some of these negotiations. And I'm sure that Barbara will be able to share with you some of her experiences in dealing with some of this. So again, there are a whole series of backbone investments that are going on and are under preparation in the order of billions to address this. I also want to share with you a little bit about the regional network that exists throughout Africa. This is what is there today, and this is what is needed. A good bit of that is under implementation on the East African side. Quite a bit going on in the West African side and in Southern Africa. And this is, the red is the missing link. And I'd like you to sort of remember this line, and remember this line, and remember this line, because I'm going to come back and address that in a little bit more detail later. Funding is secured for quite a bit of it, not all. You can see that the big long red ones are still out there. And I just shared some of that with you in Eastern Africa, and there's quite a bit going on here, and then Southern Africa is also making some progress. So what are the investment needs? What does it take? Tenfold increase in power generation by 2030 from today. That is a large number. 7,000 megawatts of new generation capacity installed every year. What is the total installed capacity at TVA? At Tennessee Valley Authority, the river just down here. Huh? Any thoughts? Any guesses? Surely you all know. Total installed capacity? How much?
25,000 or 27,000 megawatts.
It's 19,000. Total capacity is 19,000. Maybe later we can talk about what the breakdown is on that. Yeah, 19,000 megawatt is the capacity of the total TVA system.
Yeah, there are only 76 million people.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And then, whereas Africa is a completely different.
Yeah,
So,
one point
and then of course,
billion.
you know, there's nuclear, there's hydro, there's fossil, and there's gas, and a number of others. We'll come back and address that a little bit more. So you can see 7,000 megawatt is a lot of power that has to be installed in the per year between now and 2030. That's quite a bit. More than 5 million new connections have to be made. Again, each year, in order to meet the demand. Extensive and safe continental transmission network or backbones. This is what it takes. How much is this going to cost? Annual cost of $40 billion. About half of that is basically funded as in progress. So every year, there's a shortfall of about 20 billion. That number, that sounds pretty big, doesn't it? Is it? The faculty here probably think otherwise, but I'm mostly asking the students, is $20 million gap a big number?
Huge.
Compared to what? Let me give you a brief assignment. I'm sort of going back into my own faculty days. Let me give, when you go home tonight, just for fun, check and see how much on an annual basis is spent on advertising dog food on television. And compare it with this number. And I hope that you feel better in the morning, because it's rather difficult to put these kinds of things in perspective. $20 billion per year shortfall is a very small amount when you put it in the context of everything else that's going on around the world, particularly with the opportunities that you can buy with it. And we'll have a chance to talk more about that maybe this afternoon. So I want to now drill down a little bit and take a closer look at hydropower. It has mitigation capability because it has more than just power production benefit. And one of the largest benefits of hydropower is that you can store energy. With wind, you have to use what you generate. Solar, basically, unless you have rectifiers and so forth, basically you have to use what you generate. With hydro, you can store energy and use it when you need it. So that's one. And then adaptation, it can help with floods, and droughts, and so forth. So it has multiple purposes with that. So that's why it's a rather attractive thing, particularly in Africa. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Congo River. And we're going to focus on Inga, which is a particular site on the Congo River. And I'm sure those of you from Africa are quite familiar with this. The river is about 3,000 kilometers long. And about 1.7 kilometers of drop. Imagine the potential.
Yeah, wow.
Isn't that amazing? And flow, 41,000 cubic meters per second.
Right.
Now, I won't ask you to compare that with the Tennessee River. But again, tonight as an assignment, you may want to think about that. Just to give you an idea, because there's a big river out here that you see. There's a big dam, Chicago Dam and so forth. You have an image of all of this. And take those numbers and be compared with these. That will give you a better idea of what this river is and looks like. And there are a couple of things I want to share with you again in this. See, it starts in Malawi and Zambia area and then works its way through and then eventually goes into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is basically known as the armpit of West Africa, where there's a change in the turn in the size, in the shape of the continent. What I'd like you to think about now, without completely ruining the experience for you, is next time you're at the Tennessee Aquarium, go to the second floor. On that floor, there is a very nice framed map of the rivers of the world. What makes that frame different from all other things that you might have seen is that it is the map of the rivers of the world before the continents started to drift from each other. I won't show you that picture because I don't want to ruin the visual, because you should go and see it by yourself. But what you will see is that Latin America fits right in here, which means the Congo River is the headwaters of the Amazon. Imagine that. The Congo and Amazon are the same rivers. We're the same rivers. And the continents have started to drift apart. And now we have the Congo on this side and Amazon on the other side. For those, some of you might have seen the Amazon, very similar pictures, huh? Meandering, very wide, large areas, and of course, drops. So the interesting thing is that these two rivers are the same. Were the same at some point. So it's quite fascinating. But I encourage you to go and see this at the aquarium, because you'll really enjoy that frame. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Congo River because you see it's very long, and it has tremendous potential for development of hydropower. In 1972, the Belgians built the first one. I'll show you a picture of all that in a moment. 82, they built the second one, Inga 2. 351 and then 1,400 megawatts at that time. Now, of course, the Belgians did a lot of other things in Congo. Huh? I'm sure that you've read some of the books and accounts of the atrocities that the Belgians committed in Africa, particularly in the Congo. But one little thing that they did that was positive was generate and develop hydropower. Inga 3, 4,800 megawatts, 11 units, $14 billion. They're looking at, another, I don't know, 6 or 7 years before that is online. And what is most interesting is Grand Inga, 42,000 megawatts, 52 units, under a head of 150 meters. Imagine that. So we talked about TVA entire system producing, having installed capacity of 19,000. It has, let's see, you'll have to help me with all this. It has 7 fossil plants, 3 nuclear plants, 29 hydro plants with a total of 109 or 110 units. So you can see with half as many units, Grand Inga can produce 42,000 megawatts.
Very good cost, too. Great cost.
Yes, 80 billion. But if you put that in terms of cost per megawatt, you see that it's not too far off from the going price for that. Looks big and expensive, but once it's done, then there's 40. The entire Congo can produce about 100,000, but these are the ones that are really under consideration at this point. So let's have a closer look. The river comes down here. So there's a little bit of diversion here. Inga 1, Inga 2, and then a cutoff for Inga 3 for the future. The Grand Inga is a different story. There has to be a major diversion that brings it down here to this site, and that's where the 40,000 megawatts can be produced. Now you may be asking yourself, who is going to use 40,000 megawatts of power in Africa? I'll come to that in a moment. This is a picture I was able to take from an airplane when I was flying there. I spent quite a bit of time working on the Grand Inga and Inga 3 project when I was at the bank, and maybe during our conversation this afternoon, I can share some of my personal experiences on that. But you can see that here's the main river, comes around and goes down. Between there and there, there's a difference of 150 meters drop. It doesn't look like it in this photo. Inga 1 was here, Inga 2, Inga 3 would be a little bit of a cutoff, Inga 3, and then the Grand Inga would be on the other side of the city there, and it comes down. So this is what it really looks like. So over a relatively short distance, it's no more than about 15 kilometers on the river. You drop 150 meters, and you can produce. So let's be visionary and say, okay, we have just produced 42,000 megawatts. Where is it going to go? Remember I asked you to remember the 3 lines? Those are the 3. One line, all the way to Cairo. From there, you can tie into the European grid. That's where the sale comes. That's where the return on investment comes. Another one to Abuja, Nigeria, that goes into the West Africa network. And one south to South Africa, and en route, of course, is connected to other things. And then the Nile will be connected into this. So when Africa is gridded, imagine half the population lives in urban environment will have access to electricity and at a reasonable price, and excess is being sold at a good price to Europe. So the big picture is relatively positive over the next, between now and 2050 perhaps. So that's what this is. Now, the downside of all of this. This distance is about 4,300 kilometers. That makes about 2,600 miles, 2,600 miles. In terms of distance, it would be from Chattanooga to where? 2,600? Vancouver, British Columbia. That's the distance for this. Now, when you transmit that kind of a 500 kV lines, at that kind of distance, imagine the losses. So what would you have to do?
DC, that will be
DC transmission, exactly. So these will be DC lines. What is the disadvantage of DC? You cannot just stop at every village and tap off. So the DC lines cannot serve the needs of the rural population of Africa. That issue has to be addressed. But if this produces the income, then you can piggyback on other ways of electrifying the rural communities. So that's one downside. Another downside, security. Imagine 2,600 miles of transmission line, 500 kV transmission line. All it takes is for one tower to be taken down, and you're finished for a while. So part of my responsibility at the World Bank was to address all of these, and I gave some thought to that, and I thought, well, I need help from real professionals on this. So I managed to meet with a number of NATO generals in Oslo. We went in Norway. We met together for about a week, and I put the problem to them. I said, we have a line that goes through Congo, Central African Republic, Sudan, Egypt. How can we protect it? And what would be the ultimate method of protecting this line? And after about 2-3 days of consultation among themselves, they came back and the answer was very simple. There's no way to protect this. And the same thing applies to the other lines. So you see how energy begins to now spill over into other issues, which I think you've already are aware of and figured out, and I know that I don't need to get into what that is. So for Africa to leapfrog and move forward, it isn't just a question of an investor come and produce electricity. A lot of other factors are involved. And I'm sure that, taking down one tower in that entire line is not a... Now, they were talking about cameras and satellites and drones and all that. Yes, you can monitor all of this, but you can't prevent.
You can see
And when the line is down, by the time you get the equipment and the team out there to fix this problem, and those of you from Africa know how difficult it is to get to these places. Your contract is running with the Europeans, and there's penalty in those contracts. And no insurance company is going to guarantee this kind of thing. So these are the challenges, along with the opportunities in Africa. So Africa tomorrow is going to look something like this. Large GDP, larger consumer spending, millions and millions with discretionary income. What does that mean? Rapid expansion of the middle class population. Imagine that. That's brilliant. But that population is going to demand services. And what would you do with that? And of course, workforce. 1 billion in the workforce. And I'll show you some charts from the UN on that in a moment. And 50% by 2030 will be in the cities, 50% in rural areas. So you have to cover both. Abundance of mineral natural resources, all sources, it's available. And of course, telecom, banking, retail, all of that is flourishing. So Africa is really moving forward on that front to a relatively high degree. And the population projection, and this is where the real interesting issues come out. So in some of the work that I had to do and some of the work that you will do professionally, it isn't just about your technical engineering skill and work. It's about that related to everything else that goes around you in terms of your contribution. So population, look at that, for example. The rest of the world is going to be basically level until 2060. And Africa, this is Asia. Even Asia will start to fall after a while, but Africa will continue to rise. When that population moves forward, and this is ages 24, 15 to 24. Now let's look at the workforce, 15 to 64. Everywhere else the workforce is falling, age is falling. Whereas you see that Africa continues to increase at a very high rate. And the general population is the same. Everywhere else is relatively constant. It's going to be until about the end of the century. Asia is going to start to fall, but Africa will continue. So you have a major force and energy available that if you channel it with the help of technology, with the help of financing, we can create a completely different picture. Workforce, technology, tourism, all sorts of things going on. You know, not long ago I was in Africa just a few months ago, and there's the equivalent of Home Depot in Lusaka, open 7 days a week. And imagine that. So there's movement, quite a bit of movement. Agriculture, manufacturing, export, all of that is going on in Africa. And of course, opportunities, great opportunities for low carbon energy. Wind, hydropower, solar, geothermal, and of course the transmission lines that will bring that all around. So when you put all of that together, to get from here to there, challenges are daunting. Socio-economic challenges are quite significant, as you may have just gotten a taste of that. The issue of corruption, poverty, and all of that will have to be addressed. Infrastructure investment needs are high. Climate change can really affect all of this. But the opportunities are remarkable in Africa. Continental, cluster country, regional development in power, significant reduction in carbon emission, scaling up of various things, and renewables can play a major mitigating role, and they can be the agent of change in terms of production of energy. And you saw earlier that I showed you that there's a direct relationship between energy consumption and human development. So basically, and this is my favorite photo from Tanzania, that it is lions on the move in Africa. Actually, these are lionesses. It's lionesses on the move. And I believe that it's going to be women who will sort out Africa in the long run. With that declaration, I'll stop and entertain any questions you might have. Oh, good, we have just a few minutes. Please.
Has anyone that you're associated with done if you will, a survey of what the potential is for the total amount of hydro that can be built in the next 50 years in Africa? Do we know that number? Or is that something that these...
That number is in the neighborhood of 100,000 megawatts.
100,000?
50,000 of which, half of which, is already on the table in terms of, yeah. And the other half will be developed.
How do we, as a world, try to get these countries, the geopolitical aspects of this taken care of? It'd be nice if we could create a Africa Valley Authority to do the kinds of things you're talking, but there's all these geopolitical issues and country to country. Just it's a huge disaster. I mean, all this is great, and in some respects, it's like China. What China's done, of course, it's been one country, and what after you're talking about doing is exactly what China's done, and that's why they're building power plants like crazy, and moving people in the cities. The middle class is expanding like rapidly. So it's a model for Africa, except you don't have one government controlling it all. So is there an answer? I don't see an answer.
Very good question. Very good question indeed. And I'm glad that you used the example of China, because China is basically implementing exactly the same model in Africa.
Yeah, right.
Today, China has $200 billion worth of investment in Africa. A lot of it in the energy sector, for exact reasons that you were talking about. Now, they deal with different governments in different ways, environmental issues and so forth. Maybe this afternoon when we sit together, I'll share with you some of my own experiences related to that, are not a big factor. But the same kind of model is now being implemented by the Chinese in Africa, and there are lots of stories to share on that. Is that a solution? I don't believe so. I don't believe that model is a solution. A lot of other things have to be in place. The whole issue of corruption and the governments have to be addressed as part of this, rather than making this entire thing a financial deal, which is what it is today. So the whole shift in thinking about all of that has to take place, and that is going to take some time. And what I have experienced personally is that among young Africans, that shift is taking place. It may take a couple of generations, but that process, I think,
It's good to hear.
is moving forward. Yes.
I think you talked about the opportunities which are great in Africa, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about the challenges, and I'm just going to talk about the Renaissance Dam, the Damazin Dam in Sudan, and the one in Egypt, the Aswan Dam. And some of the kind of, I felt is isolation between the companies from the West and the people around there. And I will start with the Damazin Dam, because I went there and I was asked to solve some of the problems. When they built the dam, because of the corruption or some other thing, they never studied the profile of the Blue Nile. The silt during the flood completely broke the turbines. And the cooling system is completely blocked. We have 60 megawatts turbine, we only generate less than 5 megawatts. So these are the other thing. If you look at the environmental issues, Aswan Dam, on northern Sudan and on southern part of Egypt, talking about archaeology here, because people were not consulted, which is completely covered for us, from gold to also its impact on the delta, the impact of the silt on the delta, I'm sure. And I think these are things which we need to look at when we invest in Africa. I think we should not just, and the issue of course with Renaissance Dam, you just mentioned, if you read the paper yesterday, there is some, Egypt is moving some of its maybe army unit to Eritrea thing. So these are things possibly we need to look at. In particular from the West here. When we do, I think we need to study and talk to the people who are not in the government when we build it. And the other issue is the draining of brains from Africa. If I look down over here, I go to Sudan, I don't look at the top 100 students in the country and bring them over here. And this is becoming a big issue now for the, because I used to work for the Electricity Corporation in Sudan. So I don't know whether you have maybe an idea or some suggestion of how we could deal with this.
No, that is a very fair question to ask. And I spent quite a bit of time actually working in Sudan myself. And most of the dams in Sudan are essentially filled with silt and sediment.
And you can catch the fish.
And essentially they have become rather interesting looking waterfalls. And 5 megawatt is a good amount to generate from those, if that much in these. And that's a very good question and a fair question. The whole Nile Basin Initiative, and I hope Audrey will have a chance at some point to discuss all of this, because she spent quite a bit of time addressing those set of issues. And the objective for development, for example, these dams in Sudan, was originally primarily to essentially provides water for the Jazeera project, which is a very large.
That is a scenario.
Yeah, for food production, which also is having its own challenges and difficulties. So again, a regional approach where these countries can sort out some of the differences and address these issues is really the way to move forward. Some progress has been made, and more progress I think will be made in the future. But the challenge today is real. And the question again is the change of mind and the change of heart, which is not done by the military or the body of government. And I'm going to ask Barbara in a moment to make a comment on that, but before doing that, I want to respond to the second comment you made, and that was the brain drain from Africa. I hope that this afternoon when we sit together, we discuss that. There are really two sides to that story. And I think there's a very interesting, positive story to tell about that in Africa. And again, Barbara was in the middle of all of that, and she's the one who should be addressing all of these. So, Barbara, did you want to quickly?
Well, I just wanted to talk to the question about solutions. Actually, because we worked in Africa, or I worked in Africa, Vahid, globally for a 15-year period, we really personally experienced a huge shift in thinking about moving from, I worked closely with ministers of energy in the Nile Basin, of moving absolutely from country self-sufficiency to firm belief in energy self-sufficiency to energy security. And every major utility in the Nile Basin, and I'll give examples around Africa, realized that their security is about working regionally. And over the last 15 years, they've in several, at least $4 billion in joint generation projects, in, like multi-country generation and transmission. But I think across Africa, you have OMVS in the Western Africa on the Senegal River, you have the Sudak region, you have, now there's a Nile Basin power pool. I think throughout Africa on the energy side, and they're trying hard also in the Zambezi River Basin, water and energy, to work regionally. Now, it's complicated because imagine how complicated Tennessee Valley is with 7 states.
Right.
You can imagine 10 countries, some of which don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
But I think on all of those basins, we worked in several of the basins, they've made progress. So to me, that's hopeful. And the regional institutions, where they have strong energy and water regional institutions, are doing well.
I want to make a point there as well.
Yeah.
You're familiar with decision support systems, and overall system analysis and modeling of power and water and energy systems and that sort of thing. Those are pretty complicated, sophisticated things that Americans and Europeans generally lead the world. Well, today, one of the most advanced team of people that does that for Africa is in Africa. It is based in Entebbe, and it is all Africans who have come back. And again, at another occasion, Barbara will share that with you, that as part of the Nile Basin Initiative, it was decided to do. The general plan is that, the Europeans and Americans will put bids in for these jobs and take them and come and train a little bit these Africans and leave. Well, that entire mentality is changed now. And this team that is sitting in Entebbe today can compete with anyone in the world when it comes to modeling, decision support system, and high computing capabilities. And these are PhDs and master's students who used to go in other parts of the world, but they came back. Because if there's an opportunity at home to be able to make a contribution, people will go home. And this opportunity is created now. These are all African engineers, technicians, and scientists that populate this particular team in Entebbe. So movement is, I think, in the positive direction. Yes.
You mentioned something that's very interesting to me, that you talk about population increase, that they have the youngest average age, and just mention that these engineers are coming back. But in your presentation, I didn't hear you talk about how is the education level being addressed within the countries themselves. You're right, they're coming back, but they got education outside of the Africa. For you to be able to leverage the growth in population, you have to educate your population so they can take on those jobs. Is that something that's being invested in? And with all the wars and disruptions going on, how is that going to be affected?
Very good question. Altogether, there are probably half a dozen centers of excellence in Africa. Far too few. They're in Tanzania, and then one in Kenya, and then South Africa, and other places, and then and Egypt. Most of the educated Africans who are operating in Africa now receive their education outside. So that is one part of the issue. And we can let's just move back now to the infant mortality rate in Africa. And you've probably seen that the Gates Foundation has claimed that through their effort, NOVA, there's a major reduction and so forth, which is great. But then that group of 5-year-old or younger will become 5 and 15, 15 to 24, which is I showed you. Is there an educational system for them? Is there a support system for them? Are there jobs for them they enter? No. The answer to that is no at this point. And that is one of the major challenges that has to be addressed above and beyond energy and infrastructure and investment and so on, that sort of thing. And these are generational problems that require generational solutions. And with patience, we have to approach this. And we have to think about it today. It's wonderful to say, oh yeah, we've reduced the mortality rate. But fine, what are they going to do with them when they enter middle school and high school age? Do we have that available? No. Who's working on this? And this is where the investments should come. And so that this group, by the time we reach 2030, we have trained, capable people and increased centers of excellence in Africa. There's a major challenge, which is above and beyond the technical aspect of all of this. And that's why all of these pieces have to really come together for progress to be made. That's important.